Hello and welcome to episode 1 of my sound design tutorial series. Noer the boy here. I'm super excited to be sharing with you some tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years and that I think you'll find useful. So thank you to everyone who's reached out with tutorial suggestions. I'm going to start with one of the most popular suggestions, and that's bass, namely bass processing. Today, I'm going to walk you through how I would take a bass sample and apply parallel processing and subtractive EQ to get our sample at a really interesting place where we can make a really cool, layered, tight, but wild sound. So I've provided a sample that you can download and follow along. This tutorial will work with any bass sample, but I felt if we started with the same one, you can see exactly what I do and emulate that, and then build off of that and go in your own direction with it. So starting off, let's go ahead and drop the bass sample into a new track and give a listen. As you can hear, there's some nice presence in the low end and some interesting fuzz up top. So the sample is already good. It's got, plenty of headroom. It's not clipped and crushed to death. Sometimes you'll be working with a particular sound, like maybe an 808, and you're not getting it to sound how you want it to sound, and it could be through no fault of your own. Not all samples are created equal. Some ones are just not as good. They're super distorted, way too distorted, clipped, what have you. So anyways, this is a good place to start. So doing our parallel processing, you're going to go to Audio Effect Rack, double click on that, and then it'll say Drop Audio Effects here. And that's where we're going to take EQ8 and drop it on in and start building our audio effect rack. So if you click here, it'll say chain, and we're going to want to duplicate it twice here. And that is so we can create our lows, our mids, and our highs. And the number of bands that you have here will greatly depend on your sample. Sometimes I'll have 5 or 6 on a particular audio effect rack that I'm constantly toggling, on and off to get some interesting different sounds. But for this case, we're just going to have 3 bands. So starting with the lows, we're going to set a low pass at around, say, 125 hertz. Now, this could be 100, this could be at 80, this could be at 150. It really depends on the particular sound. We're just going to start with 125 hertz. I think that's a good place to start. So we have the low pass there. Now you're going to want to click mono under utility and drop it into the end of the low chain here. And the reason for that is because bass is non-directional. And we're going to want the signal here to be clean and in mono. So moving on to the mids. We're going to set a high pass at whatever our cutoff point was for the low end. So in this case, 125 hertz. So just like so. And then we're going to select a low pass at, 5,000 hertz will be fine for the mids. Now moving on to the highs. We're going to set the high pass at 5,000 hertz, whatever our cutoff was, for the mids. And then we're going to go ahead and make that low pass at the top at right around, 20,000 hertz, maybe a little more, and we'll just drag it down like so. And obviously we're going to go through and we're going to be tweaking all of these. That's where the subtractive EQ comes in. And as you play the sample, you'll notice that nothing's changed yet. We're just setting ourselves up to then use, subtractive EQ and to really process each of these frequency bands. So now we've created a basic audio effect rack, and you can go ahead and click save, and Ableton will make it a preset. So you could use this on any bass sound, any synth, what have you, and you'll just have it there ready to go. So now it's time for parallel processing. But first, what does parallel processing even mean? Parallel processing means affecting different parts of the same sound simultaneously. So, we could duplicate down the sample multiple times and have each individual track be a different frequency band. But parallel processing allows us to affect the same one sample at the same time. And it's just cleaner and more organized. So let's start with the mids here, soloing them. It sounds cool, but a little flat. So let's give some texture and some depth to this particular part. So starting off, I'm going to use Saturator. So I'm going to drop it in right before the EQ8 here, and let's turn the output slightly down, and let's turn the drive way up, and let's turn the bass slightly up. And as you can hear with saturating that sound, we're getting a more brittle, crispy sound. And the reason why I'm adding saturator in these mids here and not just on the entire sample as a whole is when you saturate a sound, you're going to lose some of the low end. And I'm sure you've found out, while you're adding saturator and overdrive to a particular bass sound, that you'll notice it just doesn't hit as hard anymore. And we're getting around that by keeping the lows nice and clean. So now you still get the intense low end, but we're getting these saturated mids. Now, a cool thing to do to enhance the saturator effect is using OTT. And you can find OTT under multiband dynamics. And OTT just means over the top. So as you can see, we're boosting the highs, the mids, and the lows. And now if we play the sample, that's pretty interesting. And so soloing it out, it just sounds much wider and fatter, but once again, if you were to add OTT over the entire sample, you'd lose a lot of the low end. So that's why we're doing it in this particular frequency band. So now, you can mess around with, the drive amount, the bass amounts, all of these different parameters. You can just go in and adjust them and get some really wildly different sounds. So I encourage you to experiment and explore. So now to keep adding space to this particular part of the sound, I'm going to throw on some reverb here at the end after saturator, but before the EQ8. We're just giving a little more depth now to the sound and just creating some interesting layers here. So, you can see I have OTT going into saturator, going into reverb. Now, if you put reverb before OTT, you're going to get a slightly different process. And the cool thing about effects chains is the order in which you place the effects greatly determines the sound. So if you're doing a particular process and you're like, I'm not sure about this, maybe switch up, where each particular effect is in the chain, and you'll get a different sound every time. So now, that's sounding pretty cool. Maybe I'm going to up the decay a little bit. I'm going to throw on a low cut on the input processing. I'm going to go ahead and turn these mids down a little bit. So I'm liking how that's sounding. So let's move up to the highs here. So soloing them, you can't really hear anything. And you might run into this issue when you're trying to affect a really clean 808 sound. There's not going to be a lot going on up top, and you might find yourself just trying to eke out any sounds and not get them. Well, a tip that I have for combating that is, that little trick we did with saturator and OTT? Well, let's apply that to this frequency band. So upping that drive all the way, turning the output down slightly. Now we're getting a little sound, and now if we throw OTT before saturator here, now we're getting something. It might sound a little annoying by itself, but when layered together with the mids and the lows, it's going to combine to give this really full effect. And that's the big thing with each of these individual layers, is by themselves, they might not sound like much. They might not sound that great, but together, they might sound really cool. So it's all about that combined effect. So one more thing I'm going to do up top is, how I added some spatial effects to this mid with the reverb? Well, I'm going to use some auto pan on this top layer on the highs, and you can let's throw it right after the EQ8, and let's turn that amount up maybe around 60%, and maybe that rate a little higher. And now we're going to get this cool stereo back and forth effect, between the left and the right headphones or speakers. And that's just going to add some cool movement within the sample. So now as a whole, when we play the entire sample, it sounds significantly different than if I were to take off this entire audio effect rack. So now that I've shown you a bit about parallel processing, I think now's a great time to apply some subtractive EQ to our bass sound to kind of carve out frequencies we don't want and to get it where it's much more lean, but still just as impactful in that low end. So with subtractive EQing, we're taking away frequencies in the mix, and I find it to be extremely effective because each of your particular parts in a song are all competing for headroom in your final mixdown. And, when you have frequencies that are competing against each other, things can get a little messy. So subtractive EQ is great for getting clarity in your mixes and better defined parts. So we're going to solo these highs again. And I'm going to go through and just scoop a little bit more out of the low end here and a little bit more out of the high end. And you can kind of hear the effect as I'm sweeping here. So depending on the tone that you want, depending on the key of your track, depending on what note you want to, bring out or which note you want to remove in a particular sound, that'll kind of dictate what you're doing with the subtractive EQ process. In this case, up here, it's really just a texture, so we're just kind of blending in that texture just a little more. And now if you hear the entire sample, you hear how we're adding just a little bit of definition in that sizzle range. So going to the mids now, if we solo it, I'm liking how wet it is, that it has a little space to it, but it sounds a little unwieldy for me. And a tip that I've picked up is scooping out a little bit of the low mids in this mid here. So you hear what I'm doing now, and it might not seem that extreme now, but when we combine it with the other bands, you hear how the lows are coming through a lot more cleaner, and that's because we're just leaving a lot of space for those lows in the mix. So with subtractive EQ, you can get in even more. You can start doing like automated filter sweeps, like right here. We could start it, at whatever, a couple hundred hertz and go all the way up. So 6,000 hertz, and that's kind of cool. But experiment with that, and just always be looking for where you can carve frequencies out of an individual sound. And subtractive EQ is great at that. So there you have it. With parallel processing and subtractive EQ, we've turned this bass into a much more interesting and expressive bass. And your options are really endless at this point. Really experiment with different effects, different orders of effects. You can even go and duplicate a specific band, do some different effects on it, and toggle them on and off in different sections. So you can create an A section and a B section of a particular frequency band. And I use that a lot in my music, and I think that would be really helpful for you. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Please let me know about future topics you'd like to see me cover in this tutorial series. I'm really excited to help you level up your sounds and have fun making music. So until next time, I'm Noer the Boy, and go out and make those beats.